Over how to divide up water from the Colorado River. I wanted to dive deeper and take a closer look at the Hoover Dam and just how crucial it is to our state, our region, and the entire nation.
In 1909, a 25-foot concrete dam went up across a desert creek in a canyon so remote it took a 40-mile mule trail just to haul in the materials. For nearly a century, the dam did its job. Then in 2005, the power company shut it down and walked away. What the river did next became one of the most closely studied ecological recoveries in the United States. A creek that turns water into stone, Fossil Creek runs through a 1,400-foot canyon in the Mogollon Rim country of central Arizona. The name sounds like it refers to ancient bones or prehistoric remains, but the fossils in the name are not biological. They are mineral. The creek is named for the stone formations it builds out of its own chemistry. The springs that feed the creek push out approximately 20,000 gallons of water per minute at a constant temperature of between 70 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit. That consistency is year-round. Arizona summers can push surface temperatures well above 100 degrees, but the spring water never fluctuates. It flows at 43 cubic feet per second through every season, fed by an underground aquifer system that keeps its chemistry and temperature stable across decades. The specific chemistry of that water is what makes Fossil Creek different from almost every other desert stream in the Southwest. The water carries a high concentration of dissolved calcium carbonate as it moves through underground limestone. When it reaches the surface, carbon dioxide escapes and the calcium carbonate drops out of solution. It coats everything the water touches. Rocks become encased in mineral deposits. Fallen logs become mineralized over time. The creek builds itself, slowly layering travertine stone across its bed and along its banks, forming natural terraces and pools with a turquoise blue color that looks artificial until you understand what is creating it. The result is the fourth largest travertine formation system in the United States and what biologists had identified as the most diverse riparian habitat corridor in all of Arizona. The warmth of the springs and the reliable water supply through drought years that would dry ordinary desert streams made Fossil Creek a refuge. The right conditions, the wrong moment in history. The dam that powered Phoenix. In 1900 and 1901, a rancher named Lou Turner filed water rights claims on Fossil Creek and its springs. The vision behind the claim was not ranching, it was electricity. The canyon walls above the creek's natural flow fell steeply enough to create a significant head differential, the kind of elevation drop that early 20th century hydroelectric engineers could turn into usable power. The problem was getting there. The site sat in country with no roads, no rail access, and no infrastructure of any kind. The nearest point reachable by wagon was 40 miles away. Everything needed to build 2 hydroelectric plants in a remote Arizona canyon would have to travel the entire distance by mule. The construction took place between 1901 and 1909. The labor force was drawn primarily from Apache and Mojave workers. The conditions were brutal. The terrain was unforgiving. People died during the construction. The mule trail itself, hand-cut through canyon walls and desert terrain, was an engineering achievement in its own right. Every piece of concrete, every length of pipe, every component of the flumes and turbines and generators came in over that trail on the backs of animals. The Childs Power Plant came online in 1909. The Irving plant followed between 1915 and 1916. By 1920, the 2 plants together were supplying approximately 70% of the electricity consumed by Phoenix. A remote desert canyon that most Arizonans had never heard of was quietly keeping the lights on in a growing western city. The plants earned their place in history. The Childs Complex was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1991. The structures themselves were recognized as significant examples of early hydroelectric engineering built under extraordinary conditions. But downstream, the creek they were built on was dying. The slow disaster downstream. The hydroelectric plants worked by diverting the entire flow of Fossil Creek through a system of flumes, channels that carried the water to the turbines. The creek bed below the diversion point received whatever water could not be captured. Through most of the operating life of the plants, that amount was between 1 and 2 cubic feet per second. The springs had been producing 43. 43 cubic feet per second of warm, mineral-rich spring water had supported a riparian corridor full of native species adapted specifically to Fossil Creek's conditions. The travertine formations needed a certain flow to keep building. The water temperature and chemistry that made the creek hospitable to native fish required the full spring output. The depth and permanence of the pools that gave aquatic species stable habitat across drought years depended on water that was no longer reaching them. Without the full flow, the travertine terraces stopped growing. The pools shrank, the habitat fragmented into isolated pockets where the remaining water collected. Into those shrinking pockets moved species that had not been there before. Non-native largemouth bass and other predator fish moved in, competing with and preying on the native fish populations that had evolved in a place without those predators. The balance that had made Fossil Creek the most biodiverse riparian corridor in Arizona shifted quietly and steadily across nearly a century. Nobody made a decision to destroy the creek. The plants were built to generate electricity, and they did that effectively for decades. The downstream damage was the cost of doing business in an era when the downstream cost was simply not part of the calculation. By the time the 20th century was ending, the calculation had changed. The decision nobody expected. In the 1990s, the Center for Biological Diversity began examining the operating licenses of the Childs and Irving plants. The plants had been running for decades on aging infrastructure, producing an amount of electricity that had become small relative to the regional grid. The hydroelectric output that had powered most of Phoenix in 1920 was a fraction of what a growing modern city required. The environmental damage the plants were causing was no longer offset by a significant power contribution. In 1999, Arizona Public Service, the utility that owned the plants, made a decision that was unusual enough to draw national attention in the conservation community. Without being ordered to by a court, without losing a regulatory battle, the company voluntarily agreed to decommission both plants and restore the flow to Fossil Creek. The context matters. Across the United States, dams had been removed before, but almost always as the result of regulatory pressure, legal challenges, or safety concerns. The voluntary removal of functioning infrastructure purely for environmental restoration reasons was almost without precedent. The Edwards Dam on the Kennebec River in Maine had come down in 1999 under federal order. The Childs and Irving plants were the second case in the country's history of a dam coming down with environmental restoration as the primary motivation. The price tag was $13 million. The native fish that would benefit from the restoration had no commercial value. Nobody was going to fish them or sell them or eat them. The money was being spent to restore a biological community for its own sake, in a canyon most Arizonans had never visited. The Yavapai Apache Nation, whose ancestors had provided some of the labor that built the original infrastructure, was part of the conversation. A tribal councilman named Vincent Randall spoke at the ceremony marking the decommissioning with language that framed the moment as an act of repair, asking the creek for forgiveness for what had been taken from it over the previous century. That framing captured something real about what was about to happen. Preparing the river for its own return. The restoration could not simply flip a switch. Returning 43 cubic feet per second to a stream bed that had been running on one or two for nearly a century would have immediately benefited one group of species above all: the non-native predators that had established themselves in the diminished creek. The bass and other invaders that had moved into Fossil Creek's habitat were perfectly positioned to explode in population the moment full flow returned. More water meant more habitat, more food, and more opportunity. If the flow was restored, with non-native fish still in place, the recovery of native species would be blocked before it could begin. In the fall of 2004, approximately 100 people gathered at Fossil Creek to solve this problem. Forest Service staff, Arizona Game and Fish Department biologists, researchers from Northern Arizona University, and volunteers worked to systematically remove non-native fish from the target stretch of the creek. They also installed a barrier designed to prevent non-native species from moving back into the restored area once flow returned. The sequence was deliberate and carefully ordered. Remove the invaders first, secure the barrier, then, and only then, restore the flow. The scientists involved in the planning understood the biological stakes of getting the sequence right. What they did not know yet was how quickly the creek would respond once the conditions were set. The day the water came back. On June 18, 2005, Arizona Public Service shut the flume down for the last time. After almost 100 years, the water that had been diverted away from the creek was finally free to follow its natural path again. There was no huge celebration or dramatic wave rushing through the canyon. The change happened slowly and quietly. Water first collected in the lowest parts of the stream. Then it spread into side channels, backwaters, and shallow pools that had been dry or nearly dry for generations. Small pools grew deeper. Rocks that had been exposed for decades disappeared beneath clear spring water. Little by little, the creek began to look alive again. Plants along the banks quickly responded as the soil became wet once more. Insects returned to the water, creating food for fish and birds. The steady flow also carried oxygen and nutrients through the stream, helping rebuild an ecosystem that had struggled for decades. Every hour, the creek looked a little more like the healthy, spring-fed stream it had once been. It was the first time in the recorded history of the American Southwest that a desert stream had fully regained its natural flow after nearly a century of diversion. That made the event far more important than it appeared. From a distance, nothing seemed unusual. Water simply flowed through the canyon as it had before people redirected it. But for scientists and conservationists, it was a remarkable moment. Many of the researchers standing beside the creek had spent their careers studying rivers that were shrinking, polluted, or disappearing. They were used to documenting loss, not recovery. Seeing clean spring water return to its original channel was something few had ever expected to witness. It was proof that when the source of damage is removed and nature is given the chance, even a landscape change for generations can begin to heal itself. A river studied like no other. The recovery of Fossil Creek was watched more carefully than almost any other restoration in the country because the scientists involved had done something unusual. Before the decommissioning, they had spent years collecting baseline data on the creek's condition under diverted flow. They had measurements of the biological communities, the chemistry, the physical structure of the stream bed, and the rate of ecological processes in the depleted creek. They had a detailed before picture, which most restoration projects lack because the decision to restore a site usually comes after the damage has already been documented. Dr. Jane Marks and her team had that baseline. When the flow returned, they could measure not just what was recovering, but how fast, compared to the known starting conditions. The speed surprised them. Photosynthesis rates in the streambed community recovered quickly, matching levels observed in healthy reference reaches of similar streams within a time frame that was faster than the models had predicted. Nutrient cycling, the biological processing of organic material that forms the foundation of a functioning stream ecosystem, showed similar rapid recovery. The travertine was the most visually dramatic indicator. Travertine formation requires water flowing at sufficient volume to carry calcium carbonate in solution across a large area of streambed. Under diverted conditions, travertine growth had essentially stopped. With full flow restored, the creek began building itself again. New travertine deposits were accumulating at a rate of more than 2 centimeters per year along a 6-mile stretch below the springs. A river is not a machine that stays broken once you break it. Given the right conditions, given the removal of the pressure that had caused the damage, the biological systems that had been suppressed began reassembling themselves on a timeline that humbled the people watching. The fish numbers nobody believed. The recovery of native fish populations in Fossil Creek produced numbers that required verification before anyone would publish them. Sonoran suckers, one of the native fish species that had been squeezed into fragments of habitat under diverted flow, increased their population by approximately 17 times. Desert suckers increased by approximately 52 times. Round-tailed chub, a species that had become rare enough in Arizona to draw serious conservation attention, increased by approximately 70 times. Speckled dace, a small native minnow, increased by approximately 150 times. Those numbers are not errors. They are the result of removing a century of pressure from species that were adapted to this specific creek, and that immediately took advantage of the habitat becoming available again. Fossil Creek became the longest stretch of stream in Arizona, from which non-native fish had been eliminated and native communities had been restored. In 2009, Arizona opened the state's first catch-and-release fishing season specifically for round-tailed chub, a species that 4 years earlier had been hovering near regional extinction. The broader biological community around the springs area recovered alongside the fish. Approximately 200 species of birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians were documented in the area. 166 plant species were recorded in the spring zone. The creek that had been running at 2 cubic feet per second was supporting a level of biological diversity that most desert ecosystems many times its size could not match. From industrial site to protected river, in March 2009, about 17 miles of Fossil Creek were officially designated as a wild and scenic river. It became only the second river in Arizona to receive this honor. The designation recognized that Fossil Creek was no longer just a former industrial water source. It had become one of the country's most important examples of successful river restoration and a place worth protecting for future generations. The new status also gave the creek strong legal protection. Under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, large developments, major water diversions, and other projects that could damage the river face strict limits. This makes it far more difficult for anyone to repeat what happened during the 20th century when most of the creek's water was diverted into a power plant. Any proposal that could affect the protected section would now face careful review and significant legal challenges. The speed of the recovery surprised many experts. The Childs and Irving hydroelectric plants had operated for nearly 100 years, changing the creek for several generations. Yet once the diversion ended in 2005, the ecosystem responded almost immediately. Water returned to dry channels within days, native plants began spreading along the banks, fish populations increased, insects returned, and wildlife slowly reclaimed the habitat. Within only a few years, scientists were recording dramatic improvements in water quality, biodiversity, and overall ecosystem health. For restoration ecologists, Fossil Creek became a powerful example of nature's ability to recover when given the opportunity. The damage had taken almost a century to create, but the first signs of healing appeared almost overnight. While full recovery would still take years, the rapid return of life showed that healthy ecosystems often remain surprisingly resilient beneath the surface. Fossil Creek became more than a conservation success story. It became proof that removing the source of environmental damage can allow nature to repair itself much faster than many people once believed, offering hope for restoring other rivers and streams around the world. Saved from draining, now threatened by love. Restoration created a new problem. Fossil Creek, once known mainly to a small community of canyon hikers and naturalists, became famous. The turquoise pools, the travertine formations, the abundant wildlife, and the warm, constant springs drew visitors in numbers the restored ecosystem was not built to handle. Trampled stream banks, trash left in the canyon, erosion from foot traffic at pool edges. The biological community that had just spent a decade rebuilding itself from near zero was now facing a different kind of pressure from people who came specifically because they had heard how beautiful the recovery had been. Land managers introduced a permit and reservation system to cap the number of daily visitors. Access became controlled. The language Dr. Marks used to describe the shift was direct. The goal was to move the creek back from being a party spot to being understood as an ecologically important place. The irony was not lost on anyone who had followed the story. A creek that had been saved from being drained dry by a power company was now requiring protection from the people who loved what the restoration had produced. Both threats were real. Both required a response. The Childs plant powered Arizona for decades, but Fossil Creek proved the greater legacy was not electricity. It was a living river, still healing and flowing as it had for thousands of years. If quiet comeback stories like this one matter to you, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.